welcome to this special Hertog Political Studies panel on views from the campus, or as I prefer to think about it, brave dispatches from the front lines of the struggle, campus struggle over the future of liberal education. As of course all of you know, students from Hertog Political Studies, the question of liberal education is actually central to the mission of Hertog Political Studies. I think it's safe to say that that Hertog Political Studies is in part, in significant measure, a response to the crisis of liberal education on campus. That is, the difficulty of getting that on campus, that part of liberal education that studies politics. That is, the challenge of finding political studies where you begin with the study of great ideas, classical and modern, political studies in which you study the tradition which your institution is a part, the American tradition, and political studies in which you study public policy informed by great ideas and an understanding of political institutions. So we care deeply at Hertog Political Studies about liberal education, and we're fortunate to have with us three distinguished authors who have recently published pieces on major media platforms about liberal education on campus. Brief introductions, because you're familiar, well, two current students and one senior alum of Hertog Political Studies. First, Rob Henderson, who just graduated from Yale. A few days before graduation appeared your piece in the Wall Street Journal on being a conservative on campus?
The day of graduation, New York Times.
The day. Now that's timing. The day of graduation. Robert Bellafiore, who wrote, I think, a little bit before graduation on studying great books at the University of Oklahoma Honors Program, where I'm sorry, I should have mentioned, Rob studied psychology at Yale. He's going off to pursue a PhD in psychology at the University of Cambridge. And he's a veteran of the United States Air Force, and we thank you for your service. Robert studied economics and philosophy at the University of Oklahoma and is headed to work for the Tax
Foundation.
The Tax Foundation here in Washington. Right, the Tax Foundation. And Elliot Kaufman, whom I met, I think, when you were a freshman, is that right?
Right.
Or a rising sophomore, Stanford University, recent graduate of Stanford University, and was it the May issue of Commentary?
That's right.
Published a piece on the intersectionality craze, the campus craze on intersectionality.
Something like that.
Something like that. Something like that. We discussed it was not Elliot's title for the piece. Anyway, a fine piece. And this summer, he's the Robert Bartley Fellow at the Wall Street Journal, and I just learned that he will continue on at the Journal in the fall as the Rago Fellow. It's terrific. So here's our plan. Our plan is to give you all an opportunity to put questions to our distinguished panelists and engage in conversation with them. But we thought I'd get the ball rolling by giving each an opportunity to say something about the origins of your pieces, what prompted you, working with editors, the Wall Street Journal, and Commentary.
New York Times.
Sorry, New York Times. New York Times. Journal want to take it? Just kidding.
No.
And then tell us a bit about public reaction. So, Rob, will you start?
Yeah, sure. So many of you know that I wrote an essay for the New York Times, and it was titled, "Why Being a Foster Child Made Me a Conservative." I didn't get to choose this headline, the New York Times did, so it's not entirely accurate. I became a conservative because of my experiences in foster care, but also my understanding of reviewing the data on childhood outcomes for different family structures, my experiences in the military, and then later on my experiences at Yale, and seeing what progressivism looks like when it's taken to an extreme. I wrote about my experience as a foster kid to shine a light on some of the problems that children go through when they're raised in chaotic environments and when adults don't prioritize family and responsibility. In the essay, I talk about my mother, who was an addict, and my father, who abandoned her and me. And many of my peers in foster care came from far worse circumstances than me. In many ways, I'm one of the lucky ones. But people feel uncomfortable blaming others for their choices. This is part of the loosening of moral norms, driven in part by college students. I think they should feel more uncomfortable thinking about the children who are harmed by decisions adults make. My essay discusses the importance of a two-parent family. So 3% of foster kids graduate from college compared to about 35% of the general population. And I wrote in my essay about a classroom experience. The professor asked students to respond to an anonymous poll asking how many of us had grown up in intact families versus divorced households or some kind of broken home. And out of 25 students, 23 had come from intact families. It was just me and one other person who did not. So that's less than 10% compared to about 40% of the general population. And other data from selected colleges reflect this kind of disparity. So it's not a coincidence that students raised by parents who prioritize family and responsibility in education send their kids to Yale. But the origins of the essay began as an assignment for a veterans writing seminar I took at Columbia University. And at this seminar, I met the New York Times op-ed editor and stayed in touch with him. I condensed my writings into a 900-word essay, simplified to be read at an 8th grade reading level. And I sent the editor my essay, and he responded with enthusiasm and connected me with an associate editor. And over the next several months, I must have followed up about 40 times with 3 different editors to finally get this thing placed. So persistence, it helps. And the date of publication was coincidentally well-timed. It landed on the day I graduated. Which was unexpected for me. Reaction to the op-ed has been mixed, but mostly positive. Some of my peers from Yale have questioned my motives. Some have questioned my lived experience. There are some students who don't like when people who come from disadvantaged environments aren't as progressive as them. But others have been more thoughtful and engaging. The op-ed has created some unanticipated opportunities, too. I was invited to Fox and Friends to talk about this essay and about my experiences. And the essay also captured the attention of a literary agency. And after some encouraging words from folks like J.D. Vance and Peter Berkowitz, I'm now working with them on a memoir proposal. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot. Robert.
Sure. I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal a few months ago called Millennials Hit the Great Books. I, too, did not choose my title. And it was about a course I took last year at the University of Oklahoma called Fate and the Individual in European Literature, inspired by a course taught by the British poet W.H. Auden at the University of Michigan in 1940. And this, we were using Auden's syllabus, which resurfaced a few years ago, and Auden's course was one semester covering about 6,000 pages, starting from Homer and going up to some point in the 20th century. And 3 of my professors at OU decided to copy the course. They spread it out over 2 semesters, so it was only 3,000 pages a semester. Starting with Homer and going up to Derek Walcott. And I decided to write this piece after, just a few weeks into the course, I could tell that it would be probably the best course I would take at OU. And so I was eager to talk about it to anyone who would listen. And at some point in the early spring, there was a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education about this course by Mark Bauerlein at First Things. And so I saw that there was some audience to learn about this course, but it was my dad who pointed out that the Wall Street Journal might be interested in hearing about this course. So I wrote something up, and my dad was friends with someone on the editorial board, so passed it along, and it got a rejection. The editor suggested that I talk more about my experience and tell a story, which I think Arthur Brooks would agree with based on what he told us a few days ago. And so I more or less rewrote the piece, sent it in again, and the editor said, we can work with this, and about a week later it was up. So it was a much easier process than it sounds like Rob had to deal with. But The response to my piece was overwhelmingly positive, actually. I haven't heard a single negative piece about it. Even the comments online are quite gracious. A lot of them are really supportive, and my classmates and professors were all quite kind when they heard about it. No one criticized me or complained about the course, which really surprised me. I'm sure there was negative feedback, but none of it was said to my face. So I was pleasantly surprised by that.
That's good. We should try publishing the piece in a different venue, in the Wall Street Journal, see what happens. Elliot.
I'm afraid I don't have one of these trying process stories. It's just the opposite. I was on a beach in Mexico on one of those embarrassing spring break trips with my college fraternity when I got an email from John Podhoretz, who's the editor of Commentary magazine. I'd previously submitted a book review to him, and he had published it, and I guess he liked it, so this time he sent me an email and said, hey, I think it actually started with, "Hey kid," comma, and I want to write something about intersectionality on campus and the Jews. And I said, sure, I'd love to. That'd be great. When he told me that it was going to be 3,000 words, I was a little more hesitant and scared, but still an excellent opportunity.
Yes.
So I went for it, and in fact, we had been talking earlier that year about some thoughts I'd been having. I was thinking, I've been in college for a while now. I'm going to graduate. Surely I've learned something worth writing about, but I wasn't, quite as arrogant to do one of those Ta-Nehisi Coates style, we were 4 years in college sort of essays. But this was an excellent opportunity, and I wanted to say something. I think you came up with the title about Jacobin conservatives and reactionary progressives. Someone still should write that, actually.
Someone should.
Somebody here, maybe. But
instead, you wrote the Podhoretz article. Hey, instead you wrote the Podhoretz article.
But in the end, I realized, sure, conservative students on campus were being these sort of, destructive Jacobins, but it had probably always been that way. That wasn't so interesting. I decided that the campus left was more interesting, and that something was happening that wasn't quite being said. I didn't think intersectionality was this weighty theory to be taken on and be addressed in theoretical terms, although people have done that, and I think they've done it well. I thought intersectionality was a model of political organizing, was a method, was a type of machine politics going on campus, and tried to make that case, and to make the case to I think actually take it more seriously than just looking at it as a theory, and reaction was pretty positive. I was very heartened to get responses from college students from all over telling me that they thought maybe I had hit on something which they hadn't seen before. That meant a lot to me. My fellow Canadian, Jeet Heer, who's the editor of the New Republic, wrote an article kind of trying to take down that whole magazine issue. This is worse than not being able to choose the title. Mine got placed on a magazine where the cover was African Americans versus American Jews. I didn't ask for that at all. But all of a sudden, I was a part of that. And, so he wrote some article, criticizing all of us. And anytime you can attract his opposition, that's always a good thing. So, I'd say it's been positive so far. And I think it helped me to get a job, too. So there's that.
Fantastic. So, so each of you have had striking experiences. Rob, you tell us about being a conservative, about the different sensibilities, the unpopularity of the conservative sensibility. Robert, you had an extraordinary experience studying great books in a very special course. Elliot, you fought the good fight, or at least observed the intersectionality, its movement from the classroom into form of political organizing. do you all have ideas, some thoughts about steps, even small steps, that might be taken at universities to bring them a little closer to the ideas, the mission of properly liberal education? We'll go in reverse order this time.
Okay, never mind.
That's you.
I mean, I'll start off with this. I've been lucky enough to get a real liberal education, and I think the best experiences with liberal education that I've had have been at this program, the summer after my freshman year, and then in a program with the Tikva Fund as well, and actually not at Stanford University. And when I think about the best experiences that I've had with liberal education, it's been times when the texts that we were discussing were live, were live options that we had to consider what they had to offer. They weren't being presented and being studied as of historical interest, of some sort of genealogical interest. They were being presented to us as something much more than that. And I found that in my courses in college, that's typically not what it is. We're so far removed from it. They become something so abstract that it's easy to, pay attention while you're there, pay attention while you're reading it, but not, give it something more than that. So I really think just the way the texts are taught needs to be changed. This isn't necessarily a helpful reform, but it has to have a good teacher. I don't think you can do proper liberal education without a teacher to lead it. And so maybe that's just a sort of limit on how much you could ever scale liberal education properly understood, and that's something to consider for sure. One other thing I would add, I think there's a big confusion between undergraduate and graduate education. I'm probably not going to pursue graduate education in the humanities, but I feel, and probably never was going to, but I feel like the courses that were being targeted at me at Stanford were really graduate courses, were over-specialized on niches that I didn't actually need. I think it starts much earlier with a freshman arriving in college, essentially wondering, who am I? And from that, you can maybe get to what is man or something like that, if you can guide the student in the right way. And those were the sorts of questions that I wanted to investigate with great texts, though I definitely wouldn't have put it in those terms. And I think that universities should focus on those larger questions instead of more specific questions, which I think are more properly for graduate students.
Thanks very much, Robert.
I think what I realized from my course is that what supporters of the liberal arts need to do is make a positive case for them. I think it's something I've noticed is that supporters of the liberal arts often get so caught up in their jeremiads about safe spaces or shortened attention spans or some other problem that they don't actually get around to saying why the great books matter. But what my professors did throughout the course was really emphasize that these books are great and how can impart wisdom on us. The syllabus even spoke about taking delight in the canon and seeing these texts as works that are beautiful and have a lot of insight into how to live our lives well. And it's not as though the students in the class were all conservatives or anything like that. But I think my professors showed us that the great books can teach us about timeless themes like death and love and duty in a way that you can't get from just ignoring our past. And so I think when people are trying to make a case for the great books, they need to show why these works are so great and so beautiful, and make clear that these aren't just a matter of becoming more learned and knowing being able to impress your friends. These books can help you live a better life. And another related point that I think supporters of the liberal arts need to realize is that they should be ambitious. Like I said, this course covered 6,000 pages, and our professors respected us enough to think that we were capable of reading several hundred pages for each class, and that was ennobling. I mean, they set a high standard and said, you're capable of achieving much more than most of your professors claim, and they taught us that we didn't have to settle for the mediocrity that a lot of professors, I think, expect us all were capable of. And because they set such a high standard, I think a lot of the students in the class were inspired to work so much harder than they would in most of their other classes. And I think that's something that professors who are trying to attract more students by cutting the reading lists need to realize. You're not going to inspire people to read the great books by making a class incredibly easy and trying to water it down. I think the way to inspire people to read these books is to say that they're incredibly difficult, but you can learn something from them by realizing that you're up to the task. And I think that nobility in studying the great books is something that a lot of people don't realize because we're too focused on the negatives.
So you reinforce Elliot's point that the recovery of liberal education depends on professors who know what it is and are willing to are capable of demanding from their students the effort to undertake it.
Yeah, absolutely. And to touch on your point about needing professors who actually are able to teach the liberal arts, one piece of feedback that I got pretty often after the piece was published was surprised that there was anyone actually competent enough to teach the course. And so, yeah, you definitely need people who know what they're talking about. And the three professors were, one was a classicist and also a provost. One professor taught English and another taught history. And so they were all able to, it certainly seemed as though any of them would have been able to lecture on any of these works. They were so familiar with them, but they also showed that they all had different specialties and could really bring those to the text. So having that competence is definitely essential.
Strangely enough, you raise a Platonic question: who will educate the educators? Rob.
Robert, what you said about being up to the task, I think that's really important. So first I'll just start out by saying that on the topic of the great books, like almost all the great books I've ever read have been in the last 3 weeks in this program. So I'm not like totally well versed on the liberal arts and everything. I'm a psychology major, be studying it in grad school too. So I'm more into fake science. So I think that in order to bring back the liberal arts, and this is going to be advice to bring back anything, but because I care about the liberal arts because I'm part of the Hertog program, conservatives perplex me because I think they have a better grasp of human nature than progressives, but then they think that the best idea always wins, and that's not true. I think the best ideas are necessary, but they're not sufficient, and there needs to be another ingredient to win. I think that people have a modest appetite for the truth and a pretty voracious appetite for status and to be good group members and to reinforce whatever is popular in their peer groups. And so one way to bring back the liberal arts would be to make it a high status endeavor to study the liberal arts. How to do that is a great conversation, I think. But what you said about being up to this task, I think, and being ennobling, like these are high status ideas. You know, if you study the liberal arts, and I was able to do this, and I overcame this, and it says something about me. If we can get that idea to spread and to be something that people care about and would be willing to share with their peers and group members, that could be one way to bring it back.
Now you implicate the administrators of the universities who need to transform the incentives,
Right.
professional, educational. Well, there are a lot more questions to be asked, and now it's your turn to ask them. Please.
Thank you. Robert Bellafiore, I found your answer to the most recent question particularly illuminating in the context of professors expecting and trusting that their students are up to the task of doing the work. And yet it got me thinking about why most people go to university today. And for most people, the answer is because most jobs will require them to have a bachelor's degree. It's a status symbol for people of a certain class. You basically have to go. And so to what degree can we depend on the university as it exists right now, as it exists for a place to people go and then end up at Goldman Sachs, to be the home of the liberal arts? Should we not put our focus more on programs like Hertog or others that I'm sure exist? Or is there a reason that we keep the faith in the universities despite their constant failures to live up to the mission?
Trial by fire. That's a big question.
I'm not quite sure I'll be answering your question, but I think that the defense of the liberal arts can't be mandatory for the students. When my professors were advertising this course, they said up front, this will be one of the hardest courses you ever take. You'll have to read much more than you will in another class where you could get a very easy A. But we think this course will be worth it if you're up to it. And I have no doubt that if we made the course mandatory, it would immediately drop in quality. So I think the first step would be universities giving students the option to push themselves more than they have to. I mean, only 30 students on a massive campus took this course. So it's not as though this one course has suddenly turned all of my classmates into great champions of literature. But you have to start somewhere, and I think the place to start is giving students these opportunities and seeing if they're willing to take it. Because I think the students who want that opportunity will take it, and the students who don't want it aren't. They might get something out of it if they're forced into it, but I think you have to start with the people who are willing to take that step of their own volition.
Okay. Elliot or Rob, do you want to add a comment?
Yeah, I would. I'm very interested to read a new book from Professor Warren Treadgold called A Proposal for a New University, or something like that, because I think I share some of your worries that the current university, or the modern research university in its current iteration may not be able to be fixed. If you think about it, what are the imperatives operating there for the institution? You have a set of financial imperatives at the top, a whole set of bureaucratic imperatives. The teachers, I think, have research imperatives, and the teachers and the graduate students, I think, have good reason to be concerned with knowledge production, with the production of new knowledge, rather than something like what we're talking about, which, as I understand it, is the transmission of old knowledge, or something like that. And so it's actually hard for me to see how you could take the university as it is now, with the goals that its actors inside of it who are making the decisions actually have. to transform it into a place that prizes liberal education, especially when its students, have every reason to want the credential, as you put it.
I think that the universities can be saved. It's unlikely. I think it can be saved. I think that these very vocal individuals, I think they constitute a minority. The administration, the activists on campus, I don't think that's the majority of the universities. I think they are a very committed and inflexible minority, and most students just go along to get along. They just kind of parrot whatever they're told to parrot in order to get by and not be called whatever name they don't want to be called. So if we could find a way to win over this moderate middle or whatever the flexible majority, we could call them, then we could stand a chance of regaining these universities and pulling them out of this activist abyss.
Yes, I'm Konyo, but could those of you who have questions, once this question's posed, indicate it, and I'll keep a queue. So please go ahead. I got you. So, yes.
Hi, Matt King, fellow member of the Hertog program. I just wanted to ask you, we talk about great books as a canon, but they could also be understood as a conversation. And not all of them agree with each other. And I was just wondering if you could share one work that you've read that captivated you, enchanted you, that you agree with, and one that maybe unnerved you, made you uncomfortable, shook you to your core.
And let's say it's allowed to be the same work, if you like. Who wants to go first?
Well, I can talk about two works that inspired me. I forget your exact word. Those were Beowulf and Gawain and the Green Knight, which we read the first semester. And I think what was so appealing about those works was that they depicted virtue untainted. In a lot of TV shows and books and movies today, it's very fashionable to have characters whose virtue is uncertain, and those characters might be very interesting, but they don't do much for actually inspiring emulation. But these two works said that these are great people, be like them. And that was well, yeah, like I said, that's not something you see in much art today. So those are probably my two favorite works I read in the class because they set such a high goal to aspire towards.
Candidates?
I don't know if I can answer for the shook me to my core, but I would go with Rousseau's Émile, which really inspired me to think about education and its uses, and especially its political uses.
Terrific. Wow.
I suppose I would say, and this would go for both, would be Machiavelli. I really like Machiavelli a lot. And I think, so for a long time I had a lot of questions about moral rightness and wrongness. I study moral psychology in lab, and Machiavelli, I think, for me, it was the first time I'd read someone who laid out this idea that morality is flexible depending on what your goals are. So there was it was a sort of revelation of freedom reading this, that you can choose what your goals are, and then you just take the necessary steps to get there. And these goals in and of themselves are morally arbitrary. You can choose moral goals, but they don't have to be. And to recognize that we can't have all praiseworthy things at the same time, and that there are always trade-offs involved. This shook me to my core, that we can't be necessarily, it's arguable, but I believe you can't be a good statesman and a good Christian, for example. This shook me, but also was very interesting and revealing.
I thought of a work that shook me to the core in the opposite way, maybe. New Year Letter by W.H. Auden, which is a poem he wrote in 1941, which I mentioned in my piece in the Wall Street Journal. And it's about how to, well, in the journal I said that it's about how to live virtuously amidst the evils that were going on during World War II. And Dr. Kyle Harper, who was giving that lecture, turned it into a kind of guide to how to live well in a time right now that a lot of us recognize is on the decline in many ways. And this poem is just really disturbing, I think, and despondent, but it suggests that that's no reason not to live well, and that it's exactly in these bad times that we have the most reason to live virtuously. And I think that what was so moving about that poem for me was realizing that it might be the case that things just keep getting worse, but that doesn't actually matter for how I act.
Well, one common feature of the accounts of the great books you all gave is that in no case was the book great because it precisely confirmed the views you already held, but in each case because you learned something you hadn't understood quite as well before the book. Please.
So first of all, I think, Rob, you kind of hit the nail on the head with sort of the absurdity of this Mielian defense of free speech that a lot of conservatives keep putting up. It is self-defeating if you just look at the evidence, I agree. But I want to take that observation a step further, give you guys a proposition and just see what you think of it, discuss. What if, in order to save liberal arts from illiberalism, we paradoxically need to start treating the university not necessarily as a liberal institution per se, but as a pre-liberal institution? Discuss.
What does that mean, a pre-liberal?
So yeah, I left it kind of open-ended, but as something that embodies values sort of either outside of or prior to political liberalism, broadly construed. So for example, if you're familiar with Yuval Levin's discussion of intermediary institutions that kind of sit in between the individual and the state, that do not necessarily have the individualist logic of modern liberalism, might we need to start thinking about applying those kinds of values and that kind of way of thinking to the university context if we really want it to be, in some sense, a liberal arts education?
I'm still not sure what pre-liberal means.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know Yuval Levin. I mean, I know who he is, but I haven't read his work on this. So, I mean, do you mean like stricter, like be more draconian about what's allowed?
Here's an example. So, strictly speaking, I think if you're really liberal, right, if you're true political liberal, you think that we should really be protecting free speech no matter where it's coming from, including, say, I don't know, free speech of people who surround professors and shout at them. Right. You also presumably think that the university shouldn't be in the business of making value judgments as to whether gender studies is on the same level as economics, because we're pro-free speech. I mean, all ideas should just compete in this Mielian marketplace. Whereas, a pre-liberal university, I think, as I'm using the term, wouldn't be censoring student speech. It wouldn't be saying you can't read the postmodern stuff, but it would be much more comfortable with making explicit value judgments about which of these things is more worth studying, and both in its rhetoric and perhaps even in its policy, steering students towards a particular vision of the good, or at least towards a certain model of deliberation that was far from values neutral.
Yeah. I think that would be great. I don't like non-judgmentalism. I think there should be way more judging going on. So, yeah, I mean, maybe not explicit policy for what people can and can't say, but I definitely would love a sort of like norms that evolve that would shame people for waking up the Yale president in the middle of the night at his home, for example. Like, maybe some people would say that's dumb, you guys shouldn't do that. I mean, oddly enough, even though we do have this culture of non-judgmentalism on campus, there's a ton of judgmentalism going on, but it's just a different kind. I think that it's impossible to have a community where there are no norms. In the absence of norms, the most inflexible and vocal minority will create them. And so I think that you know, we should combat those individuals with our own inflexible positions.
If I may just interject, I think we need to distinguish the liberal in liberal education from the mealy-mouthed kind of liberalism that you're mentioning, which one occasionally encounters on campus. The original vision of liberal education never said anything goes. We don't make judgments between great books and crummy books. We don't make distinctions between subjects that are essential to a young man or young woman's education and subjects that are peripheral. That's already a kind of a deformation. As for free speech, I myself, I'd be interested in what my co-panelists think. It seems to me that we can't have a proper kind of education unless all arguments are heard on campus. But that doesn't mean we have to judge all arguments as equally worthy. Gentlemen.
I mean, this is an argument within the people talking about liberal education. There's a book about St. Thomas Aquinas College called Escape from Skepticism, which argues that you can't have a true liberal education unless you have a sort of first principle that is religious, that sort of grounds itself in there is a truth, or else, he argued, liberal education, just exposure to all these different sorts of ideas, just throwing them at students will leave them in a state of confusion. And that you really have to be on board with the idea that there is something called truth before you get into it. And I found it persuasive, but I'm not sure exactly how you would implement it outside of a small religious institution like St. Thomas Aquinas College. So I'm definitely interested in that. I mean, you can also look at how the conservative approach to free speech has changed over time. So, you know, one of the main big conservative books about free speech, God and Man at Yale, by William F. Buckley, sorry. It was a book I think he wrote explicitly against academic freedom. Yeah. He thought that academic freedom was being used to make the universities atheist and communist. And he wasn't necessarily wrong about that. I mean, maybe there are less, out-and-out communists nowadays, but, whatever other ideology you want to replace it with, it's dominant, and it's not the ones that most of the people in this room would probably like. And so he saw, but he was living in a society where he thought he could still make an argument that the university, right, that we have enough agreement and cohesion as a society to say, no, this isn't what the university should actually be. This isn't rigorous. It's in some sense unpatriotic. It's sort of undermining our society. I'm not sure you could make an argument like that today. I don't think there's just the strength from below to make it, and maybe there wasn't in his time either because it didn't really work.
Yes, he lost that one. Yeah. But we also should one more point to make clear here. In the classical understanding of liberal education was not a skeptical education, let's study everything. It was an education for freedom. It had a beginning point. It had a beginning assumption that we're all by nature free and equal, and it was meant to be an education for those who are by nature free and equal, was meant to furnish their minds and refine their minds so that they would be better educated more tolerant, more competent citizens in a free society. In other words, an education with a substantive purpose. I wouldn't call that pre-liberal or pre-Millian. I would call that an education that's truer to the original idea of liberal education. So, yes, please, in the back. Yes, yes.
It strikes me that in this conversation there's one thing I'll use the mic. It strikes me that there's one thing kind of haunting liberal education in America, and that's, as much as kind of conservatives like to speak about liberal education and its obvious importance, they also tend to defend a free market idea of society. And often these educational institutions are also commercial institutions. And that means that they have legacy policies. That means they're deeply worried about their corporate image and their public image. And they're deeply worried that their students can end up going on to the best law schools and then the best law firms and Goldman Sachs. And in this sense, I'm echoing Quinn's point earlier. But I guess if conservatives are really going to defend a view of liberal education, to what extent does that also mean we have to go to the barricades against sometimes those who would seek to increase the commercialization of higher institutions?
Tough questions, guys. Who wants to take a crack at it? Elliot?
I think that's always the case. I mean, I just think those are oppositional visions of education. Liberal education and a sort of, I don't know, if you want to call it market education, we can. Maybe that's too dramatic. But, and at least my understanding of the history of American schooling, even just high schools and things like that, is that when the common school movement arose, it was more out of a desire to save republicanism, small r, a sort of rearguard action on that, to dealing with changes that the growth of the market had introduced to society, try to keep communities together, create this sort of shared set of ideas. And then you have a progressive movement in education that starts to shift the understanding of education into, instead of sort of pushing back against some of those market pressures, it said, who are we kidding? This isn't working. Why don't we accept these market pressures and create the best education that we can in light of the existence of a market? And I think over time you've seen that at the university. But my real hope for this is that as the cost of college education keeps on rising and rising, well, as far as I can tell, the value hasn't, like the underlying value hasn't really changed. It's just for the same sort of credentialing advantage. I mean, I'm not saying it's gotten worse, though maybe in fact I would say that. But I don't think it's improved greatly, and the price has increased greatly. So maybe at some point that sort of system will collapse and we can return to a more Republican understanding.
Other thoughts on commercialization of higher education?
I mean, so to bring this back to Machiavelli, I don't think that we can have all praiseworthy things at the same time. I mean, we can't have ultra wealthy universities plus have all these facilities and all of these great professors who you pay this much money and so on. I mean, there's a lot of administrative overhead. I think we should get rid of all the administration. But I mean, we can't have like all of this great these great universities and then also not have the money for them. So there has to be this balance between commercialization and education, and maybe it's tilted more toward one end than the other, but I don't think we could ever get rid of the commercialization aspect of it.
Robert?
I wonder, I'm not sure how much of an alternative there is to trying to win against market values. I mean, somehow supporters of the liberal arts will have to win, whether that's, there's no alternative to that. It's not just as though a lot of people will really want a liberal arts education and suddenly the universities will be reformed. We'll need to convince people that it's worth putting money towards studying the humanities. You need, like we were saying earlier, you need to get professors in in positions of authority in universities so that they can teach these courses. It seems like we're going to have to think tactically about this, no matter what. And so I'm not really sure whether it matters if we're thinking about, trying to win on free speech or convincing people that they'll earn a lot of money by studying the great books or something like that. I mean, the fight doesn't go away.
The tension between professional education and liberal education is an old tension. It goes back more than 150 years. Miller's already writing about it. I agree with what all three have said. You can't overcome that tension. But things are terribly out of whack, and as the panelists have suggested, here and there you can hope for small steps that involve a little more liberal education, but one of the biggest challenges is that large numbers of people at the universities, unlike you all, I'm speaking about faculty and administrators, can't give an account of what liberal education is. That's how hard the challenge is. Please. Yes. Oh, microphone, yes.
I have a question for Elliot. So earlier on, you named this phenomenon in universities of kind of taking works and putting them in a time capsule and kind of abstracting them from perhaps contemporary relevance. I've also noticed on campuses, however, this movement to tie works to contemporary identity politics in like modern day, and I'm curious how these two realities, if you see both of them as realities, interact with one another.
Yes. In fact, I might say the only thing worse than keeping a text as just purely of historical interest are those attempts by some professors to do whatever they can to tie it back to present-day concerns. And I think the mistake there is the present-day concerns as opposed to the perpetual concerns. I think that's how those texts need to be understood, as hitting and providing answers to those questions that are always with us, not just sort of crudely bringing it back to, well, what does this have to say about, the inequality that we face since, the late 70s or something like that, growing income inequality? Well, probably nothing, really, right? But it might have something to say about the division of talents and how building a political community and an economic community should deal with that or something. So, okay, so if you want to then take the final step, how can I take what I've learned about that and tie it into some sort of present day concern? Maybe that could work, but I agree with you. It's cheap, and I don't think it's convincing when professors skip that intermediate step and just go straight to a 21st century issue.
More thoughts on this?
I agree with everything you said. I think it's, I agree that we shouldn't be tying the liberal arts to contemporary issues, but at the same time, I'm really glad that my professors made clear that the works we were reading applied to our lives right now. It's not as though we just read the Iliad and said, "This is beautiful. On to the next work." Right? We talked about what the ideas that it discusses and how it can actually inform what we do today. And so, in that sense, I think it should be tied to present day issues, but only because those issues are always they're always relevant issues.
And actually, if I could just add one more thing, I guess the way I would sum up what I wanted to say is that, my definition of a great book isn't a book that applies to our time, but a book that applies to all times. So I think that's how they should be taught, if they're worthy.
Yes, and taking maybe one more half step. It seems to me a very fine line in a classroom it would be strange if a book is indeed great and it doesn't shed light on contemporary controversies. As Elliot said, a book for all times is also a book for our time. But any attempt to insist, anything that resembles that an argument in a great book resolves a controversy today seems to me over that line, and a misuse, well, misuse of a great book and a misuse of a classroom. Please. Yeah.
Is it on? Yeah, sorry. I wanted to touch base on something that Elliot mentioned, and this question is for all of you. I'm wondering if your personal faith or lack thereof had any significant impact on your interactions with professors, classmates, and your broader experience in the liberal arts. And by faith, I'm referring to religious faith in particular.
I'll take this one.
Elliot, take a shot.
Yeah. After the course that we took, actually, a few summers ago, I had a lot of exposure to, I guess, Orthodox Judaism, which had previously been pretty foreign to me, just like culturally foreign, and started getting into it more, and that changed what I wanted to read all of a sudden, right? It can't not. Probably should have used this book when someone asked, "What's a book that's really shaken you?" But just reading the book of Genesis, along with Leon Kass's commentary on it. Those two together, I found extremely powerful, and it made me. I guess it made me want to ask questions that I hadn't asked previously.
Please, Robert.
I'm not sure that any of the works we read particularly informed how I think about specific religious issues, even though we read Augustine and Dante, very explicitly religious works. But I do think the course confirmed something that I thought about religion, which is that people are drawn to beauty, and people look for things that they see are recognized as beautiful. And and I'm Catholic, and I certainly feel like people will be more attracted to Catholicism or other religions if they see something beautiful there, or see that its followers create works of art that are informed by their faith, rather than studying specific issues of doctrine. And the fact that students from so many different perspectives were attracted to this course at least confirmed that people are drawn to that, even if they don't quite know why they're drawn to it.
I think because I disagreed politically with so many of my peers at Yale, and so many of them were non-religious, that made me more open to religion. Simply because I didn't like that. And so I thought, well, if they don't like it, there must be something to it. So I'm still not a religious person. I used to be something like an atheist, and I'm sort of, very slowly, it's been like very glacial, like moving towards some openness to religion. I've read a lot of work from psychology, from people like Jonathan Haidt and Paul Bloom and Jordan Peterson, who's become very popular recently. I took this class, Moralities of Everyday Life, with a professor at Yale, and he told a story about how a student once asked him, what would human history have looked like if we if we didn't believe in this God stuff? If we didn't have religion, wouldn't we be colonizing the moons on Jupiter by now with all this stuff? And my professor, he looked at him and he said, there's never been a society without some kind of religion or spiritual belief. So it's like asking, what would human history look like if humans didn't have legs? Like it's just an impossible question to answer, because it's just so much a part of human nature. And I recently read this study by this guy Clay Routledge. He's a behavioral scientist, and he found that the least religious Americans are the ones who are the most likely to believe in things like UFOs and ghosts and conspiracies and healing crystals, and so basically in the absence of religious belief, some other weirdness fills that vacuum. So you don't get to choose to not be religious in some way.
Actually, according to Robert Putnam's most recent book, by far the most civically engaged Americans are Americans who regularly attend religious worship. Please.
Question for Elliot Kaufman. I was wondering if you could shed some more light on your experience of the left's attitude towards Jews on campus, specifically in the context of identity politics and a framework of the oppressed and the oppressors, and your personal experience with that.
Well, I think in some ways it was easy for the left on campus to organize their politics against the Jews. I think it was sort of a convenient target is how I would put it, probably. And as I wrote in the article, I think there are very good practical reasons for that. The simplest one is just that the most organized left-wing national campus group is Students for Justice in Palestine. And they have, boycott campaigns ready to go that are pre-prepared. So if you're looking for a cause that can rally people around, and you want to do it somewhat competently, but the problem is you're all college students, so you have no idea how to do anything competently. That seems like probably a good place to start. The person who has the plan right there and has a national organization behind them. So that's one reason. And then once you put forward a boycott agenda like that, well, you have a situation, and the question gets put to Jewish students: what are you going to do now? And this is very difficult for progressive Jewish students, many of whom are hold positions of respect and seniority in activist circles. They're allies, essentially, and all of a sudden they have to decide. And I think it's very clear to everyone around them what their choice is. And if they choose to support Israel and oppose a boycott, it looks like to all of their closest friends there that they've chosen to put themselves ahead of the marginalized, ahead of the coalition, which they claim to be attached to, but which people were suspicious of anyways, because they were probably white and probably somewhat wealthy or something. So there was suspicion of them, and they confirmed those fears. And I've seen it be traumatic for a lot of the students in those sorts of situations. And I think because of this confluence of factors, you get a situation where what happens on campus is you have the coalition of the marginalized, the intersectional coalition, versus anyone who will stand against them. And when you're standing against the coalition of the marginalized, it sure looks like you're one of the marginalizers or something. And so if you're from some other community or especially campus group, that question gets put to you directly. Are you a servant of power or aren't you? And I think the proxy is, as it has been a lot of times throughout history, what are you going to do about the Jews? I think it's a convenient. I think it's a convenient proxy.
So just to talk a little bit more about this. So earlier I said like conservatives are better at understanding human nature, but worse at implementing it. So I mean, I think this is a great example of, progressives think that, people are infinitely malleable and there's no such thing as gender and so on, or maybe there's 57 genders, I don't know. But they're so good at creating coalitions and finding enemies and creating this group dynamic of, we're being attacked and we better stop them. And I mean, this is all just like very, very kind of basic human psychology that they've been able to hijack. And, in some ways it's, from an amoral standpoint, it's kind of amazing and admirable the way they've been able to pull this off. And I think maybe we could learn something from this. And I think this is something that conservatives could do well to study human psychology and group dynamics.
Saying conservatives should learn from the Machiavellianism of the left.
Yes.
Yes, that's what I suspected. Yes, Doug.
I think it's not too controversial to say that most of humanity now and most of humanity in the past did not benefit from a liberal education. And I would grant the fact that many people in college campuses today are not only not benefiting from a liberal education, but are actually opposed to it or opposed to some form of it. But given the fact that liberal education is now and has historically been enjoyed by very few, don't you think we may be exaggerating the urgency of this issue right now?
I don't think so at all, because I think it would be hard to exaggerate the importance of the few throughout history. So, I mean, that's particularly why I think liberal education is so important. Has that Leo Strauss speech to like the University of Chicago Hillel been on the syllabus?
No.
Or something this time? Okay. Well, anyways, in there and it's crazy to think he just gave the speech to like the Hillel at UChicago. But anyways, I'll put that aside. He talks about liberal education as, I believe, a counter poison to democratic mass society. And I mean that sounds like the few that you're talking about. And I think what happens to that few is crucially important. And I think, if you want to look at the political disruptions lately, a lot of people would point to the failure of our elite over a couple of generations now. And, it's super hard to find connections between these things, but, maybe that's one of them.
Rob?
I absolutely agree.
In other words, it's true. We're all in agreement that liberal education has always been elite education. As Elliot says, we live in a form of political society, like other political societies, which in part depends upon a healthy elite, a healthy people as well. And if the elite's being miseducated, one would expect the body politic to be unhealthy.
And actually, can I
Please,
add one more
please.
thing? I have to reveal my hand by going to Leo Strauss again. But there's some point in the essay, What is Political Philosophy?, where he's talking about democracy and the classical attitude toward democracy. And he says, they didn't like it because they thought to rule requires virtue, requires a formation, and you could just never have that for the masses. Because you could never have, really, he actually gets very practical. He says you could never afford this system of education for everyone. And then he hedges himself. He says, or actually you could, but it would require taking a different attitude toward technology. And And that might create the wealth necessary to support the system of mass education, but technological advance, they didn't see it as so morally praiseworthy. Well, skip ahead to Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. He takes that head on. He says, yes, division of labor will get us all the economic advance that we want, except, he says, it will be stultifying for the masses, terribly. And he writes very vividly about this, how it will reduce people to almost something like subhuman. It's crazy. But he says, our solution is compulsory education, mass education for everyone. So if there was a bet that the ancients refused to take up, and Strauss seemed ambivalent about whether they were right or not, Adam Smith said, I'll take that, essentially. And it's a bet, and it depends on I think that same elite that can still have the liberal education, because I'm not sure that mass compulsory education will ever be enough.
Well, let's maybe, I think, consistent with your remarks, think of education, I don't know, as a kind of ascent. And let's say in democratic societies, what's compulsory is literacy, basic familiarity, political institutions, that level of literacy that enables everybody to work, to a job, and to vote at a minimum level of competence. And I would think of liberal education as a kind of capstone, right? The supreme part of education. Just as any activity, we don't expect everybody in society to play basketball at the highest level. But we want a place in society for basketball to be played at the highest level, and similarly education, seems to me. Please.
Amanda Klug from Hillsdale College. Thank you for sharing your stories. So just going off of what you were just talking about, a question I've had for a while now too, even though liberal education has been seen as elite, and at Hillsdale we definitely get kind of a backlash from this because of the status of our school. But we have core courses in our core curriculum on the great books and on the Western and American heritage and the traditions of the histories and that literature, because we believe that some of our catchphrases, that they're important for an education for self-government and for pursuing the good, the true, and the beautiful. So how can we break the stigma, I guess is my question, of saying that liberal education is for the elite, or that it is the elite who receive a liberal education, while at the same time hoping to convince people or wanting people to understand that these great books that we read contain intrinsic truths that apply to everyone?
More tough questions, guys.
Why do we have to break the stigma? Why can't we just say that it's for the elite and that's okay? And that if you would like to advance yourself, get a liberal education.
Good. What do you think?
If you want to break the stigma in that way, I think the best way to do it is to get the elites to actually take it seriously, and people would probably just start copying them, right? Just sort of as a class thing, even. But my understanding is that the elite private schools, all over, are no longer really that serious about, like teaching Latin or ancient Greek or something like that. They've moved off of that. If they were to return to it, paradoxically, I think you might actually see other parts of society following as well. Just a sort of speculation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I myself think rhetorically, it's probably not a great idea to dwell on this idea of the elite. But I go back to, I forget, several of you made this point earlier. I would go back to making the arguments on the merits for liberal education, both the intrinsic pleasures of studying the great books, their beauty, their enchantment, what they help us see, and because people so educated make good citizens in a liberal democracy. They encounter a diversity of points of view within the Western tradition. then this tends to civilize and make more tolerant, to open the mind, but also discipline the mind. I try to make these kinds of arguments. We go back to a problem. Many of those who are actually in charge with safeguarding higher education don't know these arguments or reject them out of hand.
Could I add something to that?
Please.
I think I agree with you that we need to make the case for the liberal arts on its own merits, and I think it's worth pointing out that this was the course I took was at the University of Oklahoma, a big state school, not an elite university, but there were still plenty of students who were capable of an enormous amount of reading and getting through a challenging course. And so I'm skeptical of the idea that only the smartest or the wisest are actually capable of reading these texts. I think pretty normal people can read them because I'm a normal person, and so my classmates were ordinary people too. That being said, I do think it really helps to have elites who support the liberal arts, and that gets us back into a question from earlier about the best tactics. But yeah, it seems hard to argue with the idea that if people in power are supporting the great books, other people are likely to follow.
Let's be a little clear about this. If we have a university president in this country who is somewhat famous for leading the battle on behalf of free speech, President Zimmer of the University of Chicago. Can you name a university president who has made a name for himself or herself by leading the battle for liberal education? I got to go back to Bart Giamatti, Yale University, from the 1980s. That's what we need. Please.
First of all, that's an opportunity. This thing that you've been pointing out, that the leaders of our higher education institutions often can barely articulate what liberal education is for themselves. If you're one of a handful of people on these campuses who has been through an experience like this and has learned something about that, you have an argumentative advantage, and lots of people are making progress at campuses around the country. Because of that, that asymmetry, in sort of argumentative position. My question is for Rob Henderson. Your New York Times piece it's a very personal, very moving, and at the same time witty piece. You critiqued the people immediately around you in a venue where you were anything but preaching to the choir. And you did this on the basis of this personal narrative. As you mentioned, you were sure to get some critical responses from this, and you did. What was it like to receive incoming fire on something like this, and what did you learn from that experience?
I mean, that was a lot of fun. So I mean, on the New York Times website, I got something like 700 plus comments, and I was just talking to David here about just the vitriol and everything, and I mean I expected it. It's the internet. Like, you're gonna get the worst we have to offer on the internet. Yeah, I also got some emails too from people who were very critical, people who I went to college with, people who I know in my personal life, who I guess they were like their worldview had been shook. That someone who had experienced what I had experienced was not just this progressive person who, down with whatever patriarchy or something, and
Rob,
the fact that I was
just to understand, you had classmates who were shocked to discover that someone else at Yale could find Yale an intolerant place?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Some of them were. Some of them were, you know, they were very critical of my support for the two-parent family, for example. What about the people who can't do that, and so on? Like I said, people are very reluctant to blame anyone for anything. And I also got a lot of supportive emails too. Some people sent me very, I mean, you know, my essay was personal. Some people sent me very personal emails about their own struggles and how reading this made them less ashamed of themselves. So, you know, I knew there was going to be some bad stuff. I wasn't expecting the amount of good. So,
please. Right here? Here you go. Other side. Yes. Approaching from all directions.
Hi, my name's Akash. So I think it's been pretty often observed that it's really easy to protect the free speech of people with whom you agree, and really difficult to not to overlook infringements on free speech with people with whom you disagree. And there's no question, in my mind at least, that campus liberalism today is evidence of that fact. I want to ask you guys if you think that current conservatism might be the American right might be as well. And I guess I want to put kind of two cases where I potentially see that, and I'd like to hear your views on both. One is that the General Social Survey has been polling Americans on their views on free speech for I don't know how many decades, and it turns out that support for free speech has been increasing in America for many decades when it comes to most of the groups that they poll on. So homosexuals, Nazis, Muslims, communists, etc. And the one for whom it has been very slightly decreasing is racists. As far as I know, that's the only one. And also, it turns out that according to the General Social Survey, essentially they ask their respondents to rate themselves from extreme liberal to extreme conservative, and extreme conservative, and generally speaking, as you move rightward, you become less tolerant of free speech. So I wanted to ask you about that. And then the second thing I wanted to ask you about, and maybe you in particular, Elliot, is about, you've talked about free speech on campus for Zionist student organizations. I wonder if you have any comment on the defunding of Palestinian student organizations in campuses across the country that support BDS, and then also in state legislatures in some countries, in some states, including my state, New York, provisions again for the defunding of groups that support BDS.
Let's take the general question about free speech first.
So this survey, you said that the more conservative, the less supportive they were of free speach. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Does anyone? So I do know that I don't know if that holds across the entire spectrum. But if anyone.
I mean,
my impression of the surveys by Gallup and others have shown that, over the last decade, there's been a decline in support on free speech on campus.